Our last phyla in this chapter is phylum Mollusca, which contains all of our mollusks. Let's compare them real briefly to the worms that we talked about in the last video. Mollusks are all going to have bilateral symmetry. They are all going to have a complete digestive system. And so as you remember, a complete digestive system is like a tube. It has a place where things go, it has an end where things go in and an end where things come out. They also have an open circulatory system, which I mentioned briefly in the last video. The heart is going to pump blood through the vessels, but if you look at the picture on page 543 in your book, you can see that the heart is at the bottom of the snail, and then the blood vessels kind of run up to the top. Once they get up to the top, that blood then kind of runs out of the vessels and kind of washes down over through the visceral hump and bathes all those tissues in the blood so that you can have the oxygen exchange and anything else that needs to happen. All the blood then kind of pools back in the bottom and is collected again so that the heart can then pump it back up one more time. So that is that open circulatory system where the blood does not stay in vessels the entire time. It relies on gravity for everything to get back to the heart again. And as I mentioned, we'll talk a lot more about that when we talk about the crayfish in the next module. We don't really see a respiratory system as we know it in these particular creatures, but I found it very interesting. Clams actually have a way of pumping water through themselves to feed that reminds me a whole lot of a sponge. And so if you're interested in learning more about that, the first page of the coloring sheet that I gave you explains that process, and so you can read through that if that's something that interests you. It's not anything that you have to know, but just if it interests you. I want you to notice, even though that these mollusks look very, very different from one another, the different categories that there are, they do all still have many of the same characteristics, which is what puts them into the same phylum. So we've got gastropods, bivalves, and cephalopods. An animal that is in the gastropod is a snail, and so gastro actually means stomach and pod means foot. If you've ever studied any Greek and Latin roots, you know what some of those words mean. And so it makes it kind of sound like a snail has a foot on its stomach is kind of what it looks like. So maybe that's why they're called a gastropod, because that's how it looks like. It looks like he's got a foot on his stomach. A cephalopod, cephalo means head, and so it kind of looks like he's got feet attached to his head. And so if you think about a squid and they have all those tentacles attached to the top part of them, that's why it's called a cephalopod. And then a bivalve, bi means two, like a bicycle has two wheels. A bivalve means two, and so that means that this particular animal has two shells, which I'll talk about here in just a second. Now, again, the bottom part of the coloring sheet that I gave you is the part that I want you to focus on. If you're interested in the anatomy of the clam, knock yourself out. Feel free to look at that as much as you like. But this is the reason that I gave you this coloring sheet, to try to compare these different characteristics of the mollusks. They are all going to have an open circulatory system. They're all going to have a mantle, but it's only in some of the creatures that mantle is actually going to secrete the shell. And so a gastropod has one shell, a bivalve, like a clam, has two shells, and a cephalopod doesn't have a shell at all, with the exception of a creature called a nautilus, which does have a shell, but the rest of the cephalopods do not have shells. So they all have mantles, but they don't all necessarily secrete that shell. They also all have a visceral hump, and the visceral hump is defined in your book is that's where the heart and the digestive and the excretory systems are. And so even though the coloring sheet does not label a visceral hump, the visceral hump is where all of that important stuff is located. So they all have a visceral hump. They all have a radula, which is how they scrape food into their mouths. It's there on all of them. And they all also have a foot, but that foot looks very different in each one of the different categories that we have here. In a gastropod, the foot is used on land, and your book talks about how the snail is going to have a trail of slime that it leaves behind so that it has a way to move along the land. So this is the only mollusk that you're going to see on land. the foot in a clam is going to be used to help propel it along the ocean floor. And so you've got creatures here who are walking, so to speak, with their foot, but in a cephalopod, that foot looks more like tentacles, and it's actually used to swim. So again, same parts in all of them, but in his vast wisdom, our Creator has adjusted each one of those parts to be different in each one of the creatures for exactly what they need it to be. So as you are preparing for the test, you're probably looking at this going, oh my gosh, there is so much material in this chapter. What you need to do is really concentrate on your own questions, concentrate on your study guide questions, and concentrate on the big picture of a lot of these different phyla, what's important about each particular phyla. If there's something very, very specific that we spent time talking about, like a collar cell, when we talked about collar cells, that's probably something you need to know on the test. So really concentrate on the questions that you were asked, the things that I asked you to go over, and then remember that the anatomy of the earthworm is the one that you're going to be expected to label a diagram on. So we are almost finished with this first chapter on invertebrates.